Okay, I think we're going to start this seminar nicely yet. And this is certainly the case of Christophe Salomon. Christophe Salomon is a faculty member of the École Normale Supérieure, which is a top institution in France. And Christophe has been working in atomic physics since he was a young kid. And I think we know each other for a long time. He participated in very important projects before his PhD. And after his PhD, he engaged in the field of cold atoms at the École Normale at that time, under the guidance of Professor Claude Guattari, and was Christophe, Alain Aspect, and Jean Dalibard. That was the team that made the history of the cold atoms at the École Normale, and as we all know, ended by giving the Nobel Prize to Professor Claude Guattari. And Christophe, since the beginning, he participates in all the experiments of the supercooling, cooling below what we believe will be the limit. And but since the beginning, I remember Christophe was very worried about we should do things with the cold atoms. Besides understanding better the atoms, I'm sure that cold atoms can be used for many different things. And clocks were one of the possibilities. And I still remember the first demonstration with André Cléron in the lab, in the corner.
And Bill.
Yes. Yeah. And here it is. Today, the atomic clock based on cold atoms is exactly the top, the best one can get in metrology of time and frequency. And it's already an important device for humankind, because with those devices, if we can measure better time, we can not only do better science, but we can only provide to society better equipment for navigation and so on. And Christophe is being the master of this. And not only that, Christophe is the coordinator of a few experiments in the Spatial International Station. So he's the coordinator. And he told us that in 4 years, there will be the launch. There is a prediction to have the launch of the super atomic clock in space, where, of course, we should start to understand a lot of things on the absence of gravity and everything. So a new physics may be generated there. On the top of the old wonderful things that came with the fountain clock, you know, the variation of fundamental constants, high precision, destroy some of the theoretical things that people believe were there, in the case of the nonlinear quantum terms in the Schrödinger equation by Weinberg many years ago. So this is a topic that really can generate can set new standards for the science we know, and certainly will bring new things to stimulate even more the whole community. So it's a pleasure. Christophe came here when I was starting my lab, and I would like publicly to acknowledge that. We published the first paper on acceleration here, and Christophe came from France and was a month here.
Yeah, 6 weeks.
6 weeks. And now he returned, and it's a pleasure for us to have you here. I hope that we improved during these 20 years.
Yes.
But if we didn't, you have to come back and stay another time to help us, to push us more. So he'll be telling us about precise time with cold atoms, and of course, he's going to give us a broad view of it, of the field, and the new things to come, and the present things that are ongoing. So please, Christophe.
Thank you, Vanderly. So you've given already half of my talk. But first of all, I would like to thank Vanderly and the university for this great opportunity to come back here in Sao Carlos. My last visit was exactly 20 years ago. And I'm very glad to see that in the meantime there is some time and frequency activity going on here. And we have welcomed in Paris a number of people from Brazil, including yourself, but Daniel, and also Kilvia and Monica. Monica, I'm not sure here yet, but we met her yesterday, Monica Santos. So I would like to show you briefly that laser cooling actually has brought a little revolution in the ability of timekeeping, enabling essentially 2 orders of magnitude gain, between 2 and 3 orders of magnitude gain, on the precision with which we can time system and measure frequencies. And this story is actually ongoing. I will show the trend of the field from the microwave clocks to the optical clocks, which are being developed now. And all these systems use laser-cooled atoms. And the reason is that laser cooling and trapping is getting better control of the momentum spread, velocity spread of the sample, and also position spread of the sample. And the more control you have on this, the longer observation time that you can have on the atoms. And if you have a long observation time on the atoms, you can make precision measurements on these atoms. And time is one example of a precision measurement on the atom that I will describe in this presentation. So let me begin with this logo, because I like it. This is a combination of cold atoms, with laser beams here in a space environment, where atoms are cooled to microkelvin temperature, where the temperature is correspond to velocities of a few millimeters per second. Here, the phase of Einstein reminds us that time can be tested, and the precision of general relativity can be tested with clocks. And I will show some examples of this. And in the back here, there are fringes, which are actually resonance signals in atoms. And these resonance signals are governed by quantum mechanics. And you know that reconciling quantum mechanics, general relativity, is a big challenge of modern physics. And it is especially interesting to design experiments that will test whether the interface between quantum mechanics and general relativity can be tested and hopefully put in defects. It would be a dream to show that violation of the equivalence principle, for instance, variation of fundamental constant of physics, and I will comment this in this presentation. So let me thank the participants who have worked on these clocks in Paris over the last essentially 15 years. This is a group of André Clairon and the permanent members that many of you know, Sébastien Bise, Pierre Lemont, Philippe Laurent, Michel Lourdes, Giorgio Santarelli, Peter Wolf is doing some theory aspects, and now Jocelyne Guénard and Peter Rosenbusch and Daniele Rovera. And as I mentioned, Monica Santos came at the early days of the rubidium fountain, and more recently Daniel Magalhães contributed to it. We have a very fruitful collaboration with the University of Western Australia, who are developing cryogenic oscillators. And I will explain a little later why our fountain works very well because of using this system, simply because we have a local oscillator of very high quality, which is developed by a liquid-cooled sapphire oscillator. And my group at yes. So just to begin, let me convey the excitement of the field of laser cooling and trapping of atoms. Over the last essentially 10 years, there has been not less than 3 different Nobel Prizes in this domain. And hopefully it will continue. Here is a picture that was taken when Bill was visiting our group, actually, in was 1990, right?
That would have been
89 to 92, yeah.
That was Halloween.
Yeah, that was Halloween 89. And we had a party in Bill's apartment in Paris, Rue de la Baie de l'Épée, where you can recognize very famous faces. I mean, there are at least 2 Nobel Prizes on this view graph. Bill here, in his best suit, Claude Cohen-Tanuji with his nœud papillon here. This is Jacqueline Cohen-Tanuji, Jean Dalibard here, André Clairon here, Hal Metcalfe here, and your 2 daughters, Bill, and one has got married in last August. And so in 2001,
Julian is there, so.
oh yes, right here, Paul Julian, yes, sorry, and Barbara Dalibard, Saïda Guelati, and the wife of André Clairon here. I was taking the picture. And then in 2001, Bose-Einstein condensation, Bill showed this picture yesterday, where even colder temperature and quantum dangerous gases have been obtained. And connected to my talk is the 2005 Nobel Prize given to Jan Hall, Ted Hench and Roy Glauber on precision laser spectroscopy. So doing spectroscopy in the visible part of the spectrum with ultra-stable lasers, and the invention of the optical frequency comb, that is an essential tool now for atomic clocks to connect the optical frequencies of the spectrum to the microwave domain with a very simple system. And I'll explain this a little better later. So I will start with very basic things. What is the fundamental principle of atomic clocks? Introduce the notion of frequency stability, accuracy, and so I apologize for the specialists in this room, but I think it's good to set back the grounds for the operation of these devices. And in the second part, I will concentrate on new tests that you can make with these new systems with better precision. You can search for possible drift of fundamental constant of physics, and this was Dirac, the first time pointed out that there is no fundamental reason, on cosmological scale, that the electron mass or the electron to proton mass ratio or the fine structure constant, 1/137, that we are not able to calculate. Why these fundamental constants characterizing electromagnetic interaction should be constant on cosmological scale. And I will show you that recent experiments have brought very severe limits on this possible variation of fundamental constants. With a clocking space of high accuracy, we can make a new test of the redshift of the Einstein effect, the gravitational shift of the frequencies. If you have a clock here or a clock 1 meter below, you have a 1/16 relative frequency shift, and the clocks, modern clocks, reaches this domain. So we can just show by eye that you have one digit changing. The 16th digit will change when you move a clock from 1 meter to a lower elevation by 1 meter. And then I will describe the space clock project, which is called FARAO. This is atomic clock ensemble in space. So time measurement, this is an old story, essentially. Since many millennia, people have tried to measure time, and essentially measuring time is to find a periodic or quasi-periodic phenomenon in order to count cycle of this phenomenon. And for many years, nature was providing periodic phenomenon like the Earth's rotation or the Moon rotation with the calendars. Humanity has used all types of calendar, but there are more modern natural periodic phenomenon or quasi-periodic, the orbit of pulsars, which are very regular, which have been discovered in the last 30 years and have been modeled with very high precision. So this is one class of natural phenomena which are periodic or quasi-periodic. But there are also another class where people have tried to make clocks, tried to devise themselves a periodic system, and one of them is the sandstone. The Egyptian invented this sound box that you return, and you return it, and you measure very precise time interval. And Galileo invented the pendulum, which I recall here because it's at the basis of the fundamental properties of clock, essentially. You would like to find a simple phenomenon which is described by a very small number of parameters, so that you can compute the period of the pendulum and also try to establish its limit. For instance, when I compute the period of the pendulum, t period equals square root 2 pi square root of L over g, I see immediately that if g has fluctuation, and we know that the little g has fluctuations because of tides, for instance, then I will have a perturbing effect on the clock. And so I would like to understand that if the temperature changes, then L will change, and therefore the period will change. This is bad for my design of the clock. The second important parameter, crucial parameter for clocks, is that this pendulum can tick at various frequencies. But you see immediately that if the pendulum ticks faster, then you will detect faster a small change of an event. So you have an event that you want to measure, you will count 5 periods or 6 periods. And so if the pendulum ticks much faster, then you will detect very small changes of an object, of a phenomenon that you would like to observe. So the second key parameter, which will also apply to atomic clock, is that the faster the pendulum, the better will be your time resolution. I should say time interval resolution, because we don't know exactly what is time. This is a philosophical question that I have no time to address here, but what we measure is time interval, and we measure time interval with clocks. And so modern clocks now use a periodic signal, which is an electromagnetic signal. So electric field or magnetic field of microwave or light, which is a nice and periodic signals. And what we do is that we lock this electromagnetic field to atomic lines, and this is what I will describe on the next view graph. So assume you have an atom, with a transition between two energy levels, with a frequency, central frequency mu A, and a width delta nu. What you do in atomic clocks, it's a composite system. You have an oscillator that provides some already periodic signal, but perhaps not very stable. And this oscillator will interrogate the atomic line. So we'll be probing the atom and measuring the transition probability for the atom to go from the ground state to the excited state. And you will scan this oscillator through the resonance line. And when you do this, you see that you have a maximum transfer in the excited state. You detect this maximum peak, and then you apply a correction to the oscillator, so that the oscillator is forced to stay locked to the peak of the atomic resonance line. So in practice, this is done by measuring the transition probability on the left and on the right. And with the servo system, you force the oscillator to stay locked exactly on average, by jumping from here to here, to stay locked in the middle of the atomic resonance line. So you see an atomic clock is a composite system done with an oscillator that you have to provide and an atomic transition. And you see immediately that the narrower is a line width, the better will be your clock, because you will detect very small changes of the local oscillator here by having this discriminator, as we say it. If delta nu gets very narrow, then you will see very small changes of the frequency of the oscillator, and you can correct with the servo system this small change. So you see that the narrower is the line width, the smaller is the line width, the better will be the precision of the lock system. And this is what's called atom center, because with very slow atoms, you can measure atoms for a fraction of a second, for instance, and get a line width in the range of 1 Hz. So before explaining how the operation of the clock in more detail, let me look at the evolution of the quality of timekeeping as a function of time in centuries, the 16th century, pendulum, and to 2009 now. So the Huygens pendulum, Galileo/Huygens pendulum, was refined to a point where it had an error per day. This is plotted here, 1 second, 10 seconds per day. The best pendulum at that time had already a precision, which was not bad. A day has 10 to the 5 seconds, and this pendulum had less than 10-second error. Then people developed chronometers, mechanical systems with very clever devices to be insensitive to temperature and so forth. And this was required actually to do a navigation across the Atlantic Ocean to know the longitude very precisely, because you can't do it very well, and so you need to know the time you have elapsed, the time you have traveled through the ocean. And the chronometer of Harrison had such second error. The clock, short clock here, has been refined to 10 milliseconds per day, a remarkable process for a mechanical system. And then the quartz oscillator was invented in the 50s, 1950, which is the vibration of a crystal, a quartz crystal, that is coupled to an amplifying system, and is used in every watch that we have now. Has been refined tremendously since that time. And in this part of the spectrum is the atomic clock. So the first cesium clock was done at NPL in 1967 by Essen and Perry, and had the first performance were in the range of 10 microseconds per day error. And then the commercial clock that we can buy now are in the range of 10 nanoseconds per day. That's quite good already. And these are the type of clocks which are flying in the GPS system right now to provide time navigation, which is used in many systems. The millisecond pulsar time stability is in this range also. The variation of the Earth's rotation rate, when I compare to the natural phenomena, is in this range, a few milliseconds per day. And the cold atom clocks, the phantom clocks, have rich precisions between 100 picoseconds per day and 10 picoseconds per day. They have progressed over the last year. And very recently, the NIST group of Jim Bergquist and Dave Weiland has developed clocks which have 2 picoseconds per day error. Using optical clock that I will describe a little later. So you see there is essentially 7 orders of magnitude gain over the last 50 years. It's quite spectacular. And I don't know if it will continue for a long time like this. I will point out to some limits. We can already anticipate some limits in the timekeeping capability and this will be done at the end of this talk. So you see there is a very fast slope, and this is the atomic era. So essentially the atoms are the best system to produce precision time interval measurements. So now you go a little further in the definition of the seconds. So you open your dictionary, and the dictionary sends you this definition for the second in the SI system is a duration of 9,192,631,770 period of radiation, electromagnetic radiation, which corresponds to the transition between two hyperfine levels of the ground state of atomic cesium, cesium-133, which is the most abundant isotope. So this is essentially a dictionary definition, and you would like to understand how to implement it. But what you see in this definition, which is very nice, is that it relies on the intrinsic stability of atomic energy levels, which are governed by quantum mechanics, and we can compute very well the energy level separation in an atom. We can compute the perturbation of these atomic energy levels induced by electric field, by magnetic field, for instance. So this is the key aspect of atomic clocks, is that these atomic energy levels are well-defined, quantized, and so forth. And as I said before, the control of the temperature to 1 microkelvin or even below is very good because the velocity of the atoms are very small. And with this very small velocity, you can observe your sample of atomic cloud for a duration on the order of 1 to 10 seconds. And so, of course, this small velocity on Earth do not last very long, and this is why we use the fountain geometry on Earth, or microgravity environment, and this will be the space clock program that we describe in the second part of the talk. So on Earth we use a fountain, and this is now 15 years old, but the principle is very simple. In order to counterbalance the effect of gravity, we start with the cold atoms, which are laser cooled here. We launch them through a microwave cavity with a hole at the center, in which we apply a microwave field which is very close to this frequency here, so that we are close to the resonance transition between these two energy levels in the atom, in the ground state of cesium, so it's a magnetic dipole transition. And so the atom interacts in the cavity the first time on the way up, make a round trip in the Earth field, and the second time in the cavity. This produces an interference phenomenon, which is called Ramsey resonance. And then we detect by light-induced fluorescence whether the atoms have made the transition between the ground state to the excited state, as we scan the signal coming from the local oscillator. So this local oscillator, in most cases, is a quartz that you can fine-tune, so that after multiplication you reach this 9 gigahertz frequency for cesium. So the two key parameters are the stability of the system and the accuracy of the clock. So the stability deals with the residual fluctuation of the system. Once you have locked your loop, of course, no system is perfect. You have a residual fluctuation. And the accuracy is your ability to claim that you have indeed realized the definition of the dictionary seconds. So here is a resonance signal that you observe in this fountain, in one of the fountains in Paris. So the resolution of the screen is not good enough, you see, because each point here is a single measurement point. The signal-to-noise ratio is 5,000 per point. It is at the quantum limit. You measure a quantum system, and you find a quantum limit to this measurement, which depends on the square root of the number of atoms. And in this ball of atoms, we launch 10 to the 7 atoms about, and this corresponds exactly to this limit to the signal-to-noise. The long interaction time comes from the round trip time, like this, about 1 second, and corresponds to a fringe which is here 0.94 Hertz, about 1 Hertz. And what you do for the clock then is that you measure the transition probability on the left side of the central fringe. You have to identify the central fringe, but that's relatively easy. And then you measure transition probability here, there, and then you make a digital integrator. And if you have a small difference between the signal on the right or on the left, you send this signal to correct the average frequency to synthesize. So this is a resonance signal that we have in the fountains, which show a line Q, if you wish, a ratio between the frequency of the operating clock, 9 gigahertz, to the line width of the clock, 0.9 hertz. So the Q factor is 10 to the 10. It's already quite good, but you will see that in optical clocks, this line Q factor can be 4 or 5 orders of magnitude higher. Now, when you have one such device, you cannot prove its property unless you have a second device to compare to. So here is a frequency stability recording between two fountains. One is a mobile fountain that we have developed over the last year, and the FO2 fountain, fountain 2 in Paris. And you see that when you average, so the clock works in pulse mode, you produce a ball of cold atoms, you launch it, you detect, you collect a second ball of cold atoms, you launch, you detect, and so forth. And you lock each of the error signal on the two individual fountains, and you measure the beat, simply the beat between these two clocks. And so this beat has a nice linear slope here in this log plot, with a slope -1/2, which shows you that you gain in the precision of your time interval measurement by increasing the measurement time. So when you repeat a measurement, if it's white frequency noise, as we say, white noise, when you repeat the measurement, you reduce the error bar simply as a square root of the integration time, and this is exactly what you see. And so you see that after averaging a bit less than 10 days, the beat between these two fountains reaches 1/10^16 in relative frequency unit. And it goes down, and so we have even points now by averaging for longer time. And now the fountains operate essentially quasi-unattended for duration in the range of 3 months, 3 to 4 months, with very small umlaut events, which sometimes depend on the power line of the Paris city, or stupid things like that. And so we have now points which are below 1/10^16 with these microwaves. So essentially, this is the best stability measure for fountain. You see that overall, this is in this range. Actually, this is kind of factor 5 below hydrogen masers in this kind of time interval, because hydrogen masers drift. But actually, we use masers we use the fountain to pilot the maser and the maser time scale that we have in Paris. And the second important thing, which deals with the accuracy of the system, is that we have two fountains operating on cesium atoms, and so they should give the same frequency. But do they really give the same frequency? So the frequency instability is 1/10^16, and we find typical agreement, which is not 1/10^16, but between 2 and 4, depending on the type of fountain we use or as a function of time. When we do the measurement in 2006 or 2008, we find some slight discrepancy, which points to the fact that the accuracy of the fountain actually is in the range of 2 to 3, 10 to the 4. I will come back to this result in 1 minute. So here are a few pictures of fountain. One of ours at the Paris Observatory here. Here is the PTB fountain, here is the NIST fountain. So typically the size is 2 meters tall, with a cooling zone here. I should put the Brazilian fountain. So with a cooling zone here, with fiber system, fiber couplers, several layers of magnetic shield around the system in order to prevent very small influence of the Paris metro, for instance. And then the atoms go up and down and are detected also in an area like here. So I've counted about 14 fountains in operation in various primary time and frequency band in the world. 8 of them have today an accuracy at or below 1/10^15, and there are in the range of 12 which are under construction in various countries. So all these fountains now are permanently compared with the GPS phase system and contribute to the international atomic time by periodic calculation of the difference between all the fountains which contribute, which send their signal to the BIPM, the Bureau International des Poids et Mesures, within Paris. And with this, we maintain actually as precise atomic time as possible for all applications. And this you can download, actually, this atomic time you can download from Circularity of BIPM. So here is a state-of-the-art for these microwave fountains and this issue of stability and accuracy. So let me come back to this equation, which is crucial for distinguishing between stability and accuracy of the device. The output frequency of the clock at a given time t is in principle equal to the cesium frequency, because this is the principle of the atomic clock, but it's never perfect. So it's equal to nu cesium times 1 plus epsilon plus a time-dependent y of t with 0 average mean, and this is the frequency stability. So it's 1 plus y of t, but you may have some shifts of frequency which are grouped into this term which I call epsilon. And so an accurate clock is a clock for which the term epsilon is very small. And so you would like to your clock to provide a cesium frequency, but you have this list of parasitic phenomena. Some of them are obvious, magnetic field corrections, electric field correction, atomic density, atom interact with each other. So you can have some shift actually, and in the cesium fountain, this is one of the main limitations. And so the frequency shift epsilon is the sum of a large number of parameters that I have no time to describe here, but if you have questions, I can give more details here. And the accuracy of the clock is your ability to know this shift and correct them. For instance, we apply a magnetic field in the fountain to have a nice quantization axis and define the magnetic states in the fountain. But this is an important frequency shift, but it is measured by the atoms very well with a precision much better than 10^16. So we correct for this frequency. So this is how we set the accuracy of the fountain, simply by measuring the collisional shift, the magnetic shift, electric field shift, blackbody radiation shift, and applying this correction.
Epsilon would be systematic errors?
Would be systematic errors. A sum of systematic errors, and usually we add them quadratically, which is not always legal, I would say, because some of them might be correlated, but this is a tradition, that this shift. So you see that the accuracy of the device is your ability to measure this shift with enough precision. And so cesium fountain reach accuracies in the range of 3 to 4 10^16 now, the best fountain. And the frequency stability, I've commented to it before. When you operate with large number of atoms, you can have a stability of 1.4 10^14 at 1 second, going down to 10^16 at 50,000 seconds in the best case, but it can be 1 day or a few days, depending on the type of fountain and the local oscillator that you're using. Now, what has been very new is that actually, if you bring your atomic clock operating no longer in a microwave domain but in the optical domain of the spectrum, remember the pendulum that I was mentioning before. The faster the pendulum, the better you will have a resolution to measure a phenomenon. And so if instead of operating the clock in the microwave domain, you go in the optical domain of the spectrum, you will be able to detect smaller changes in a shorter time. So if I call the quality of the clock the following parameter, the product of the signal-to-noise ratio times the operating frequency of the clock, 10 to the 10 hertz in the microwave domain, or 10 to the 15 hertz cycles in the optical domain, divided by the line width. So you want a narrow line width, so the quality of the clock is this frequency divided by the line width, times signal-to-noise ratio. You have the potential quality of your atomic clock. As the line width is Fourier limited, delta nu is 1/t, so you can rewrite this equation as 2 nu in the Ramsey scheme, 2 nu operating frequency of the clock, interrogation time, T, capital T, times signal-to-noise ratio. So to have the best clock, you would like to increase the frequency nu, increase the interrogation time T, and increase the signal-to-noise ratio. So if you can do the product of these three, you will devise a very good clock. So people follow two ways. One is to use trapped ions, in which T can be very long, essentially arbitrarily long, but limited by the local oscillator, by the laser, ultra-stable laser that you have to develop to interrogate your resonance line. So this time can be very long, second, a few seconds. But with ions, they interact by Coulomb repulsion, and so these clocks are limited to small number of ions, and ultimately one ion in the trap, because when you begin to put more than one, they interact and produce unwanted energy shift. But nevertheless, when you put 10 to the 15 here, 1 second here, signal-to-noise of 1, which is a quantum limit that you can have on the resonance for a trapped ion, you can have a clock that operates at 10 to the 15 at 1 second. And this is exactly what Jim Bergquist and De Bruyne have done. This is one example of a cryogenically cooled mercury ion trap. You have a ball trap with bars in which you apply RF fields. And at the center of this trap, you have one single mercury ion, in the case of here, and they have locked to this single ion at the quantum limit and obtain a stability in the range of 4 10 to the 15 tau minus 1/2 down when you average, as I've shown before, when you average over 10,000 seconds, then this goes in the range of 1/17. So they have measured the essential shift in the clock and reach an accuracy for mercury of 2 times 10^17. So, and for aluminium, a similar clock with aluminium, using quantum information processing actually, they have reached an accuracy very close, also in the range of 2 parts in 10^17. So you see this already 1 order of magnitude beyond the cesium Fountain accuracy. Of course, this system actually do not yet work as operationally. It's complicated system, with lots of optical tables and lasers. Nevertheless, this is asking the question of the future redefinition of the seconds, because these systems have already surpassed by 1 order of magnitude the microwave clocks. So this is one line of very active research. And the second line is to say, okay, what about using neutral atoms? Because neutral atoms do not interact. So hopefully I can bring the signal-to-noise ratio very much larger. Because I said before that the signal-to-noise is limited by the square root of the number of atoms. And so in our fountain, we have a signal-to-noise of 5,000. And so we have 5,000 here, whereas on the ions there is 1 here, and the frequency is 10 to the 5 times higher here, but we have a signal-to-noise of 5,000. So the stability that I've shown on the graph before, here, this is only three times worse than the optical clocks, you see. So there is a great potential of using neutral atoms, simply because you can have long interaction time, and there is a scheme by the Katori in Japan in which you can trap the atoms in an optical lattice, in which you can have both large signal-to-noise ratio and long interaction time, and also large optical frequency operating the visible part of the spectrum at 10 to the 14 or 10 to the 15. And the group of Juni at GILA has obtained already an accuracy of 10^16 and a frequency stability in the high 10^17 by operating on a lattice of neutral strontium. So it is 2 electron atoms, but you can have also ytterbium and so forth, or mercury, that is developed by Sébastien Li's group at Paris Observatory. And so there is big prospect also to bring the neutral atom clocks, also in this stability range. In terms of stability, this has been achieved. In terms of accuracy, state-of-the-art accuracy is 1/16, but will improve clearly. There is no fundamental limit, except the black-body radiation shift, but I have not much time to point to it, which requires that the temperature of the chamber should be stabilized rather well in order to reach 17 frequency accuracy. So this is to show that, indeed, operating the clock at a higher frequency will get the pendulum at a higher frequency, if you wish, will get even higher precision. So let me show you the best result that has been obtained with comparing 2 optical clocks. This is a NIST group, as I mentioned before. Mercury ion in one trap, aluminium ion in another trap. They are linked with a fiber system to a frequency comb system that enables, actually, that provides a set of lines which enables a direct comparison between the frequency of this line comb to this comb line here. And you can lock this system and make essentially measurement of the ratio of the frequency of the mercury ion to the frequency of the aluminium ion without going to cesium. So it's a direct optical to optical comparison. And you can plot the ratio between this aluminium ion to mercury with 17 digits. You see, so that's quite impressive. And here are the error bar of 5×17, which is the sum of statistical error in the frequency comparison and systematic shifts both on mercury and aluminium, as I've described before. So it's remarkable that now you can make direct optical comparison with very high resolution. Let me remember that 10^16 is 1 meter, 10^17 is 10 centimeters of Earth's gravitational potential. So you will see that actually this kind of resolution now will be able to be bringing interesting geodesic application, and I will describe this at the end of this talk. Now I would like to turn to some application of these atomic. You all know the GPS systems, with a very small receiver that you have even on your mobile phone now. You know where you are, so there is no way that you can get lost. Now you always find a hotel nearby or a restaurant nearby, so unless you are in the desert. So clocks are useful with the GPS system, actually, in various domains in geodesy. Drifts of continent has been measured. Also the datation of millisecond pulsars, these natural periodic systems, require good clocks to be timed precisely. Very large baseline interferometers require also a good clock to correlate signals emitted by distant stars and resolve a small angle. I mentioned already the atomic international time, the synchronization of distant time, the realization of universal coordinate time, UTC. And what I would like to focus on is on a new possible test in fundamental physics, test general relativity, the redshifter that I mentioned before. This has been measured in a beautiful experiment by Bob Veso in 1976 in a rocket, gravitational redshift, at a level of about 10 to the minus 4. And with clock at 1/16, you can reach a quality of the test of 1 part per million. I will come back to this in 1 minute. One spectacular effect is the apparent slowdown of photons in the gravitational field, which is called the Shapiro delay. If you were able to put a high-quality clock in occultation behind the sun on a particular orbit, you could improve the Shapiro delay to the present value, which is 3 × 10⁵ to 10⁷, or perhaps a little better. And the last thing that I would like to comment on is that you may search whether the fundamental constant of physics, such as the fine structure constant, alpha, does it vary with time or not, and you can put today, you can put severe limits on possible rate of variation of alpha as a function of time. So how you do this? Fundamental physics tests using stable clocks. The first one is search for variation of fundamental constants. Let me recall you the Einstein equivalence principle, that if you are in a locally freely falling reference frame, the result of any non-gravitational measurement, for instance quantum mechanics, should not depend on where it is done in space, or when it is done. That's a pillar of general relativity, the Einstein equivalence principle. And so, this you can test with clocks, because this implies the stability of fundamental constant. Alpha is square root of 4 pi epsilon 0 if you are C, the mass of the electron, the big G, and other quantities like this. And so, in particular, the ratio of transition frequencies in different atoms, like equivalence principle of Galileo, but you can do this on the atomic physics of different atoms, or molecules, should not vary with space and time. And this you can test regardless of any theoretical assumption. You can measure the comparison between two clocks on January, on December, and over years, and see whether you see any possible drift of the fundamental constant entering in the transition difference in the atoms. But of course, there are modern theories based on string theory and brane theories and so forth, which say that the Einstein equivalence principle is not the whole story. Some people predict that there is a scalar field, phi, upon which some fundamental constant would vary, like alpha would be a function of phi, the mass of the particle would be a function of the scalar field, which is a field which depends on the cosmological evolution. But of course, this is theoretical speculation. And so violation of the equivalence principle are expected at some level, and there is a long list of papers, but here I mentioned one by Damour and Veneziano. So people expect violation of the Einstein equivalence principle, but the question is at what level? So with clocks, you have very precise system, and 1 × 10⁻16 is 1 second error over 300 million years. 1 × 17 is 1 second error every 3 billion years, less than 1 minute over the edge of the universe. So you may ask yourself, well, do we have the same alpha now than a billion years ago? And so you have astronomical limits, very interesting astrophysical limits, but with clock you can test it, the rate of change, you can test the rate of change of fundamental constants now, or in the last 5 to 10 years. And so the principle is very simple. You compare two or several clocks of different nature as a function of time.
So, just to clarify a little bit. So the idea is, why it's reasonable to think that fundamental constants change? I think Dirac had this argument that, well, we didn't have a electron before, so it was formed. So those things evolved during some time, and maybe we are seeing the tail of this variation now.
Yes, so this was Dirac conjecture. Actually, Dirac conjecture has been proved not to be correct. Dirac, what he made was actually try to reconcile great number. As this large number hypothesis, when you compare the Compton wavelengths, the electron mass, big G, and so forth, you find ratios which are 10 to the 40. You know. This is surprising because it's very hard to describe physics over 40 orders of magnitude. And so this was his first conjecture was of this kind. And of course, people working on unification of electromagnetic strong and weak interactions have a convergence at the Planck time. You can define a time, a Planck length, a Planck mass, and a Planck time, and all this occurs at extremely high energies. So there is some energy that you can translate in time, and the quantum of time is 10 to the 43 seconds. There might be a discretization of time at 10 to the 43 seconds, which is way below anything we can do in the next century. But so this is the kind of idea that Dirac had in mind in trying to put the fundamental constant of physics together and see this huge discrepancy between energy or time scales or distance scales. So if I come back to the clocks, you have several choices. You can compare two types of microwave clocks. Then you will have limits, combined limits on alpha, ME over MP, and magnetic moments, which involve also strong interaction. If you use, for instance, a microwave and optical clock, you will have the same kind of comparison, a function of alpha, ME over MP, and G. If you use optical to optical, it's a bit simpler because the dominant term now is because in an atom, the energy level between the resonance line is governed to first order by alpha. So if you compare two optical clocks, you are mostly sensitive to changes of alpha. But if you compare optical to microwave, you have a combination of fundamental constants. You can test combinations. And that's very useful because we don't know which of the fundamental constants might vary. So it's good to test as many of them as possible. And so here are a few pictures of clocks, some iron clocks, neutral strontium, this one I've shown before. So the goal is to compare this clock. Here I give just one example, which we've done in Paris, actually, with Monica Santos at this time, and more recently here. And so this is a comparison between a rubidium microwave clock and a cesium over 10 years. And we started our first rubidium fountain 10 years ago, and here you see our error bars, which was large initially because we improved the system. And now we can fit this, we see a small slope, but which is not very significant compared to the error bars. We can claim that the ratio of the rubidium frequency divided by the cesium frequency is minus 3.2 plus or minus 2.3. So it's 1 sigma in English, 10 to the 16 per year. So from this you can deduce various combination for drift of alpha and the ratio of magnetic moments. So I have no time to enter into this detail. And you can go even beyond, connect this to the quark mass and the energy scale of quantum chromodynamics on QCD, but I have no time to go into this detail. But you can see that in this comparison, you can set already a very good limit on possible variation of a combination of fundamental constants. And you can combine it actually with the NIST result, the aluminium-mercury comparison that I've shown 5 minutes ago, where they have compared these two atoms over 18 months. And as I said, this is optical-optical comparison. And so this is giving mostly a limit of alpha. And they have found that there is no alpha change at the level of 2 10 to the 2.4, 10 to the 17 per year. So you see, by all these limits, you can plug this limit into this equation and set a limit on the variation of, for instance, strong interaction force. So all these comparisons are interlaced, if you wish. If you have one limit, here you can plug this limit into the other combination of constants. So this is one example of fundamental test that you can do with this advanced clock.
The theory at least says that's negative variation in spectrum.
No. The theory.
It seems clear that you have a negative variation.
This is true, but this is in the error bar. So we have no claim at this level. We have to wait. If we decrease the error bar significantly, a factor 5 to 10, then we will begin to. So here you hit the limit. If you have a single measurement, it will be hard to convince people because they say, okay, are you sure your temperature is well controlled and blah blah blah. So you have actually to have at least 3 because you can compute the ratio of variation between these 3 clocks. You can compute if alpha changes in the aluminium mercury, you can give a number for this variation, And if you detect a non-zero variation, then you can predict another couple of frequencies. For instance, aluminium cesium. Do you see it or not? So before we do a three, or more of course, a three-body comparison, it will be very hard to convince people.
Of course, if you make an optimal comparison, you get a value for alpha dot over alpha.
Yes,
But
but
if you don't know anything about how the mass, well, not the mass ratios for cesium, but how, let's say, the G-factor ratios go, you can't say for sure what it would be for a, say, a mercury-cesium ratio.
yes, if, just to simplify, if you have three optical clocks, you can compare all the ratios, so you can set a limit on alpha. But we don't know whether alpha should vary more than strong interaction or, so all tests are valid actually. So any over MP, you can use molecules also. But they are related. The key point, the key message is that they are related. If you set one limit on any over MP, for instance, then you can infer limits with a set of comparison on other fundamental constants. So you're right, it's negative. In the quasar-absorption light, the emission of lights of quasars, it was found that alpha was a bit negative in the past. But this is controversial. It has been highly controversial. There are contradictory results, but okay.
So that would indicate an opposite change from what
This would be an opposite slope,
Yeah.
exactly. So there is no. So you could replot this kind of diagram with this scalar field. This scalar field has both a coupling to matter and a strength of coupling and a range. And so you can make a 2D plot putting limits on this amplitude of the coupling from this scalar field to matter, on the amplitude and range. And so it's a 2D image. Okay, now I turn to the last part. Can you do interesting tests also by putting this type of clocks in space? So this is the logo of our space mission, ESSE's Atomic Clock Ensemble in space. There was also a project in the US, and that Bill participated too, but NASA has been reoriented by the Bush administration toward exploration, and this has killed a very interesting fundamental physics program that was running at NASA. But in Europe, we have gone through the rail, as we say, and we are on good tracks. We got the full funding now for the flight models, both of the cold atom clock and for the palette that I will describe now. It's called Atomic Clock Ensemble in Space, which consists of a cold atom clock, hydrogen maser developed by Switzerland, and a very nice time and frequency transfer between ground and space in order to take advantage of the high stability of the space clock. So this is shown here. So this is the International Space Station, which is orbiting the Earth at 400 kilometers. And the concept is very simple, is that you have a high-quality microwave frequency link, time and frequency link, between various receivers on the ground. So Brazil will be here, with an antenna. And the time transfer system is not like GPS. It's a two-way system where the antenna emits and receives. And this is to compensate for the fluctuations of the atmosphere, which is crucial. And the GPS system has some intrinsic limitation because it's a one-way system where you have only a receiver. But this does not allow you to reach the frequency stability regime that we are interested in, which is 10^17. So in this mission, we put a cold atom cesium clock in space that I will describe in 1 minute, removing the fountain round trip in the Earth field, perform fundamental physical tests, including variation of fundamental constant. And the nice aspects of orbiting around the Earth is that you have a worldwide access. So you can do a global comparison of various types of clocks between the various laboratories. So here I have a list of the laboratories who have manifested their interest to contribute. I've seen San Carlos University, so you have to bring your fountain at 1×16 in 4 years, Daniel. That's a nice goal. So that this would be the only fountain in the southern hemisphere. So South America, southern hemisphere, Australia has no atomic fountain. So very important to have data which is not only biased for the northern hemisphere, but also in the southern hemisphere. And And so this is about 35 institutes and plus some theory groups. So there is a lot of interesting comparison to make between all these systems. So this is schematized here. Many laboratories have different atoms, different clocks in the microwave, which is in black, in the optical domain of the spectrum. And so it would be great to be able to compare them at the same time, and search for variation of fundamental constants by having a set, a parallel set of a network of comparison. And with the link which is being developed now, we hope to be able to do this at 10^17 period, which will be 3 10^18 over 3-year mission. And so we have to make the final test on the link, and also the clocks has to develop to this level between now and the date of the mission, which will be end of 2012 or early 2013. So this is the application of searching for drift of variation of fundamental constants at this level. So let me show you a little bit of hardware now to finish. So ESA has attributed to us a cube, well, not quite cube, but parallelepiped here, of about 1 meter on the side, 800 millimeter in this dimension, and 60 centimeter or 600 millimeter in this dimension, with a maximum mass of 227 kilograms, power 450 watts. So here is the schematics of the cold atom clock tube far out that I will describe in 1 minute. The hydrogen maser is put vertically on this fundamental table. And the antennas to communicate to the ground are, here the Earth is pointing upwards, are on the top of this platform. And the challenge of this experiment is to have absolute automatic control, and we have cold atoms and things like that, so quite a few lasers and things. And also thermomechanical stability. You have to sustain the launch, and the launch can provide, has a spectrum of vibration, but typically a few Gs per square root Hertz, and you have the system to survive this and be totally automated. And this is the challenge of this mission. So now I turn to the cold atom clock. The principle is very similar to the front-end clock. You have a cooling zone here, a microwave cavity, which is a variant. It is a two-zone microwave cavity, just like in commercial atomic beam clock, except that we have a larger hole to have larger atom number 3. So we designed a special cavity here. And so the atoms are launched very slowly through this cavity and detected here in a detection region, which is a bit tilted to avoid background cesium pressure here. And the overall system is 90 centimeter long. And so now if you launch the atoms at a very slow velocity, let's say 10 centimeters per second, you can have an interaction time here of about 5 seconds, so a line width of the resonance in the range of 0.1 Hertz. Of course, the clock, if you launch very slowly, then you will not collect all the atoms at the end, so there is a trade-off. But the nice thing is that you can change the velocity, between 4 meters per second to 4 centimeters per second, so 2 orders of magnitude, and this is very good for the accuracy evaluation of the clock. The lower the velocity, the lower the residual Doppler effects and so forth. So it is very good for the accuracy. So we shoot for an accuracy of 1 10^16 for this device. So here is the little movie of the operation of the clock in microgravity. You have a cooling zone. You collect the atoms. You launch them very slowly. It's about the right velocity here. First Ramsey interaction in the microwave cavity. Second interaction. And then you turn on the detection beam to detect whether the atoms are in the upper state or lower state of the transition. From this, you generate an error signal here on the fringe, and then you correct the quartz oscillator, which is in this box. And then you repeat the cycle, cooling, launching the atoms, Ramsey interaction, and detection. So we have built an engineering model of this clock in some companies. So you have a box, which is a laser source here. On Earth, we operate it vertically, because it's a one way, so we have to cope with gravity. Therefore, the fringes are a bit wider, 5 Hertz wide. We have locked to these fringes. We have very nice stability for the system, just in line with our prediction. So this box is about a basket, a shoe box, basket player shoe box, 40 centimeters tall, and the tube is vertical. I have a few images of the laser bench, which is 20 kilograms, 36 watts, 30 liters, it operates both in vacuum and air, because we will be in the vacuum of space, in a temperature range of 10 to 35 degrees. So outside of this range, it survives, but it's not operational. And so it's temperature regulated. So this bench actually has been working now for 3 years without any manual intervention. So it's not too bad. Providing signals to the cesium tubes through fibers, so these optical fibers. So we have quite a few equipment, extended cavity diode lasers, acoustic modulators, PZT, some motors to optimize the power through fibers. And it's been working quite nicely for quite a long time now. So this is the laser source, and I think it can certainly be minimized much further. I mean, the technology we choose here was kind of conventional, and I think with integrated fiber optic system, fiber couplers, you could shrink this kind of box by another factor of 4 probably. But you want to maintain reliability also. There is and the cesium tube here with a detection region, a magnetic shield, some of the magnetic shield have been removed, and the capture with the fiber system. Many of these systems have been vibrated already and have survived, not all, but have survived the vibrations. And so this is what we are working on here. The cavity has been tested in atomic fountain, and this is especially designed cavity, and is compatible with an accuracy of 116 for low velocity atoms in space. So what we will do with this clock is test the redshift effect. Let me recall that the 3 minutes, 24 minutes. I will conclude soon. Let me recall that a clock in orbit, 400 kilometers, and a clock on the ground will give in their reference frame the proper time. But now when you compare this time, actually, you see that in a different gravitational potential, U2 and U1, the ratio of the frequency as measured on the ground in potential U1 is given by this equation. U2 on U1 equal 1 minus the difference of the gravitational potential at location of the clock 2 minus at the location of clock 1, U2 prime. Plus, it's a blue shift, is plus 4.6 times 11 in this equation. And so you can measure it by making the ratio of 10 to the 16 by this quantity to 2 parts per million. So this would be a factor 35, between 35 and 70 beyond the gravity probe test of Bob Besso in 1976 using hydrogen method. And so there is large gain on the redshift test that can be made. And to finish, I would like to point to some interesting application of these clocks. Let's assume that the ground clocks progress nicely in the next 5 years, and that they reach 10 to the 17 accuracy. Today they have 2 10 to the 17, so it's realistic to anticipate that the accuracy will improve in the next 4 years. And assume that the link, and we have good reasons to believe that the link will operate also at 10 to the 17, then what you are entering is a new interesting domain where you can use the redshift not for testing it, but in a differential fashion to do what I call relativistic geodesy. Essentially, you have 2 clocks, you set one arbitrarily on the geoid, and you would like to know what is the distance to the geoid of the second clock. And so for this, you can use any time transfer system, including a space one or a fiber optic system, which has also made very nice progress recently. And so you compare the frequency of this clock to the frequency of that clock, and you get essentially the difference in gravitational potential between these 2 clocks at a level which becomes to be interesting, which is 10 centimeter level when you have clocks at 10 to the 17. And so this is actually quite competitive now with satellite missions, and this is an image of the Earth potential recorded by the Chang'e satellite, which show the deviation from the geoid. In red, this is upper, in blue, this is lower from the geoid. And remember, the geoid actually is a equipotential surface, but which is not materialized very well. It's computed. This is the equipotential surface as close as possible from the average sea level. But the sea level has fluctuations, and actually I have talked with geologists quite extensively in the last year. And because of hydrodynamic effect, temperature effects, of course, the geoid can depart from the average sea level by 2 meters, which is 2 10 to the 16. And so I think clock can bring an interesting contribution to it. here. And in addition, when you compare, the geoid determined by space can be much more precise than 10 centimeters, but you don't know where it is. You see, by satellite measurements, people have determined the geoid with an uncertainty in the range of 5 centimeters, or even better. But what is not compatible is what we would call the accuracy of the system, in which they don't have precisely defined reference points. And Brazil, in particular, is not well mapped with respect to geoid, because it's a very large country, and between the south of Brazil and the north of Brazil, the GH over C square has 1 meter error. So you could make a mobile fountain, have one in São Carlos, bring it to the Amazonia, where it's not easy to measure. You have water and potential, not that easy. That might be time dependent. And by making a long distance clock comparison, you would set a nice reference height system over Brazil. Okay, so this is just to point that this is an interesting application with a very high capability time transfer system. You can locate clocks, reference clock on the ground at 10 centimeter level. And if the clock improves, probably at 1 centimeter level, if our link operates sufficiently well. But I would not claim that we can reach 1 centimeter with the ESS system, certainly with the fiber system, but over shorter distance. And also I would like to finish by saying that this is interesting, but now at 1 centimeter level, this will set limits to the capability to have precise time, because we know that the Earth's potential has fluctuations. There are tides, and there are crust motion, there are earthquakes, and so forth. And at this level, some of it can be modeled, but some of it cannot be modeled. It's not predictable. And so we can anticipate that there will be limits to the capacity of using the precise time delivered by atomic clock at the level of Natus 18, because this clock on Earth will be limited by Earth, by the softness of the Earth. And so then there are proposals actually to put these clocks in space, because when you move away from the Earth, all these local perturbation fluctuations average out very fast. And so I think the 10^20 clocks will be necessarily in space environment. So let me just end up by showing the location of the ESS platform. This will be on the European Columbus module, which had been launched in February of 2008 to the International Space Station this year. There is a Japanese module, which has been installed here as well. And so the current launch date is end of 2012, most likely beginning of 2013, with a Japanese rocket, because the US shuttle will have been retired at that time, most likely, for a mission duration between 18 months to 3 years. So let me summarize. So I hope that I've shown you that microwave clocks, have reached very interesting stability and accuracy level. They are operating now in a routine fashion at this level of stability and accuracy of 2 to 3, 10 to the 16. We hope that we can have these microwave clocks both on Earth and in space in a not too distant future. Optical clocks now have surpassed already the definition of the SI second by 1 order of magnitude. So this raises the interesting question of what would be the best redefinition of the SI second, because no good to have units which are no longer in use now. You see, units are to be used, and we have other examples with Josephson junction, with the volt and the ampere, where people are using derived units based on Josephson junction and quantum Hall effect. So it's no good to have units which are not in use. Something that I did not discuss, but it's very interesting to look whether you can develop clocks with quantum correlated atoms, in which you use the quantum information to improve actually the operation of the clocks. And as our fountains operate at the quantum limit set by the square root of the number of atoms, if you entangle the atoms, it has been shown that you could reach some sort of Heisenberg limit where the clock's ability would not be 1 over square root of the number of atoms, but 1 over the number of atoms. Could be a very large gain, but of course it's a formidable task. And Vladan Vuletic at MIT has got some 6 dB spin squeezing already on Rubidium recently. I heard the talk, but I have not seen the paper, but perhaps it's out. So this is also a very interesting direction to investigate. So the ESS's mission will be launched most likely early 2013, will enable comparison between distant clocks at 10 to minus 17, will make large improvements on relativity tests, essentially the redshift term, and also on limits on variation of fundamental constants, alpha, magnetic moments, MU over MB, and so forth. There are other interesting applications that I did not discuss, which is to monitor the GPS or Galileo, the European system, the clocks from space, where you have no perturbation by the atmosphere. And also you can monitor some earth science, you can do radio occultation experiments. So all these applications are under development now in the frame of the ESA mission. And finally, clocks at 10.17 or below will probe time-dependent Earth potential. And so you can do it both as very interesting for geodesy, but also as some limit for the use of a very precise time. So there have been proposals actually to ESA, EGE, Einstein Gravity Explorer, to put the next generation of optical clocks in space, and for global time dissemination. I mean, there are several proposals, or even one very ambitious proposal, SAGAS, which is to send 17 clocks at the edge of the solar system to probe both the gravitational aspects and the redshift aspects. To make test of relativity, but also test of mass distribution in the solar system by having both accelerometers and high precision clocks. So I think I will stop. I thank you for your attention.
So most of the, I'll just speak. Look, this is gonna work. I'll just speak, look, everybody can hear me. Most of the fundamental constants you talked about varying were dimensionless constants, but you did mention big G, which is not a dimensionless
Yes,
constant.
yes.
Now, I'm not sure whether we've had this conversation, but people have had conversations about whether it is even in principle possible to measure the time variation of anything other than a dimensionless constant. So what's your opinion about this?
I have a mixed opinion. To first order, I agree with you. What has a meaning in physics is only ratios, dimensionless constant like alpha, mu over mp. However, I mean, as G, big G, enters into physics by another means, by gravitation, and when you put Planck scale and Planck length, and Planck mass, I think it will be. I'm not absolutely convinced that there are no tests that cannot point towards variation of big G as a function of time.
So just to continue, you remember perhaps a few years ago when the astrophysical observations suggested a variation in alpha, then there were some papers published to argue that the variation in alpha, which one could imagine as being e squared over h bar c, depending on your units, that the variation could be ascribed to one of those constants rather than the other. Do you think that's silly?
Well, I think that many of these papers are silly. Right. So you could say the speed of light is varying.
Yeah.
Or h.
Right, but at NIST, we claim the speed of light cannot vary because it's set by law.
It's fixed by law, exactly. but when that is true, and you could do the same for h. You could fix h.
And we intend to.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. So my feeling is that I would say the physics will be nicely understood if we measure ratio. That is clear. Whether there are no other ways to see time dependent of big G, for instance, which is not a ratio, I would be careful because you could imagine some variation of orbital periods or matter as a function of time that could lead to variations. So if you can tie it to other constants.
What
Not
about
necessarily a ratio, but tied into another set of constants. And what I would like to add also, in all these aspects, you could either say that the fundamental constants are varying, or that the laws of physics can be modified. And this is also something to have in mind, that many of these papers say, okay, but I modify general relativity by adding such a term, which is a non-linear term, and I can reproduce a variation of alpha as a function of time. So this is also the second part of the problem. Can we make a consistent theory beyond Einstein's theory that can encompass the variation of constants?
Do you think there's any difference in measuring variations in space, in location, compared to time with respect to whether or not only dimensionless constants can be studied?
From the data that has been done with clocks, you can also set limits on space variation when you average over, for instance, the orbital motion of the Earth around the Sun, and you have winter and summer, and the Sun-Earth distance changes, so you can already set limits by this annual variation to space variation. This has been done, I have numbers here. I would say they are testing two aspects of the equivalence principle, so I think both are interesting.
But do you think that you can measure the space variation of things that have units when one presumes one cannot do that, except perhaps in some special circumstances for time variation? Can you measure space variation of things that have units?
I would say, I've not thought much about that, but I would say yes. If you look in the universe into different directions and find systems which are almost similar, two types of quasars, if you can model its quasar period in this direction or that direction, you may find a preferred frame. And Kostelevsky has developed a lot of extension of standard model to include anisotropy, so violation of Lorentz invariance. So I would say, I don't see why it should not be possible to see space variation of quantities that you can relate to other units.
It's not the same thing to measure space variations as time variations, since you set C by law equal to a fixed value.
Mm-hmm.
When you do space variations, you're doing time variations. Otherwise, because C is by law equal to what it is.
Well, yes, but it may be that there are variations that, in addition to time variations, for example, I might imagine that things vary in different parts of the universe by more than they might vary in time. I mean, it's true that space variations are time variations, but there might be more than that, because it might depend upon the direction or the local mass density. There may be any number of things that might change things.
Yes, but then to prove that you have a space variation, you need to know the mass density with sufficient precision also. So
Yeah.
I'm afraid that it will be very hard to disentangle the
Well,
fact that
Yeah, so that's what I'm wondering about. Yeah.
Or you will measure the mass density here with supposedly
Yeah.
identical systems.
You know, Flambaum has speculated that maybe the variation in alpha could be different in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, because it's not the same when it's measured. But there are probably other questions.
Let's see.
The big G is the least accurate fundamental constant. And then is it possible to improve the accuracy of that constant using this improved plot?
With improved clocks, I don't think so. I mean, BG is really macroscopic measurements, and so BG has improved, but without the use of clocks, essentially, or standard clocks.
Would we, like, using redshift measurement, would you come with some ideas of getting big G out of this harder? That's depending on the mass of
Yeah, this is GM. Huh?
Yeah.
GM enters everywhere, so you would have to know the mass. All the physics scale as GM. So.
It would be nice if we could come with some scheme to measure big G with accuracy.
Yeah, well, big G measurements have progressed nicely in the last decade because there was this discrepancy at a level of 2 10 or 10 years ago, which is now solved by a new generation of experiments, including Seattle very advanced balance, torsion balance with mass distribution. I think their value is in the range of 2 or 3 times 5 now.
I think that's right.
But
If
you're
you look
right.
on your wallet card, I think you'll see it.
Yeah.
A technical question: how many atomic clocks are carried by each satellite in the present GPS system?
I don't know the exact number.
There is more than one each
Yeah,
satellite.
they are redundant.
And
yeah.
how big are they?
Oh, they are very large, GPS satellites. 4 tons or something like this.
4 tons each.
Yeah. They have to emit quite large power because they are 20,000 kilometers elevation. I don't Bill perhaps know better. It's hard to know actually how many clocks. I know that they are redundant in the sense that they have a set of cesium clocks of rubidium lamp pumped clocks. I would say my guess from my memos that there is about 3 types of clocks times 2. So rubidium and cesium.
Yeah. I think that each satellite has on the order of 3 clocks, but some have more, and some even have different kinds. There are a few GPS satellites that have some hydrogen masers, but only a few. So it's not a standard thing, unless maybe in the new generation they standardize it. But in the original constellation, they were not standard satellites. They varied from one satellite to the next, but they're all synchronized continually.
And they improved
With
also.
logic clocks.
There are several generations of clocks that have been put in the GPS system. So in Europe, one type of clock will be passive hydrogen lasers, and they are flying right now. I've seen the first data. They seem to operate quite well, actually. Keeping the target is to keep 1 nanosecond after 2 hours or so, or 4 hours, just so that they keep synchronized, stay synchronized to emit the signal.
If there is no further question, let's thank again Christophe for the
Most but those are not clocks. Those
No,
are
but they
setting
could
limits
use-
on alpha.
Yeah, but you could measure limits on alpha by the